Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this podcast in a series of podcasts we're doing on the theme of ideas into action, inspiring leaders to mobilize collective solutions. My name is Peter Molyneux. I use he, him, and I'm the England lead for GLE. And I'm absolutely delighted to have Sammie Gallais with me today. And Sammie, I think you're just going to introduce yourself to us.
Yeah, hi Peter. It's lovely to be here as well. So I will introduce myself in Maori, if that's okay, and then I
Mm.
will introduce in English. So ko ko tainui me te arawa tuku waka, ko Ngāti Rangi Wewehi tuku iwi, ke tauire I roto te hōtaka ko mātai henengaro o Waipapa Taumata Rau, ko Sammie tōku ingoa. Um, so my name is Sammie. What I basically just said there was a little bit about my background. I'm from a rohe, a group of Māori called Te Arawa o Tainui, and my iwi, my tribe, is Ngāti Rangi Wewehi. I'm a doctoral student in clinical psychology at Auckland Uni. I'm 28 years old, and I do my work in Māori queer research.
That's fantastic. So say a bit more about the work you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, sure thing. So the work that I'm doing at the moment, it's all around this doctorate degree. And so the way that it works in New Zealand is we don't usually have masters for things like clinical psychology. You go to a doctorate, and as part of that doctorate, you do a thesis and a bunch of clinical work and placements and internships. And so, as part of the main bulk of my doctoral studies, is my beautiful thesis. And it kind of flows on from some work that I did in my master's thesis back in, I think, 2021,
Mhm.
which effectively looked at how Māori queer people, also known as takatapui, how Māori queer people deal with the pressures of today or the issues of structural determinants. So we looked at how things like family support, how peer support, school safety, deprivation, all those sorts of things, how they influence takatapui youth suicide. Um, and so after doing all of that,
Mhm.
I sort of decided that for my doctoral thesis, I would look at what are the mitigating factors and how do we actually deal with takatapui mental health in therapy. And so my doctoral research is basically about providing clinicians in New Zealand with a model of Māori queer health that they can use. Yeah, so that's most of what we're doing at the moment.
So what's really interested you about what you're finding? What are the things that have either, have you been pleased about or you've been surprised about in terms of what you're finding?
Yeah, I think as somebody who is Takatapui, so someone who identifies as queer, has Māori lineage, um, a lot of positionality I feel like has had to come into this type of research where many of the things that I found are really similar to the journey that I've been on in the mental health system in New Zealand as well. The one thing that I think I found is that I think that there's this kind of rhetoric that clinicians want to be culturally competent and they give it a great shot and many of them are. But it's also really confusing. I think the way that we're teaching clinicians cultural competency,
Right.
because so much of, especially becoming now a clinician myself, so much of what I think we get taught is this stuff has happened to Maori people. We were colonized. We were affected by Victorian era rhetoric of gender and sexuality and all of these negative things. And so clinicians are stuck with, oh, I can't really erase colonization. So what do I do now? But I think what I'm trying to push in my research, and I think what I found as part of the research is that there's a really strong deficit narrative that happens in clinical work where so much of what we focus on is about the deficits that exist in mental health. But the flip side is really that once we deal with those deficits, then what's left over? And is the definition of well-being just somebody that doesn't have deficits, or what's beyond that? What is thriving? And so I think that at the moment that's kind of what I found to be like this sort of narrative that's coming through of how do we teach clinicians to empower people? How do we help clinicians to be empowered themselves? Um, and these like queer culture, Maori culture is so cool, that I just think there's so much of this cultural information that I think we're missing that we could be teaching clinicians more of.
Yeah. So you sort of talked a bit about where some of the challenges are in that. I mean, do you have a
Mm.
feel? I mean, as you say, we cloak ourselves in the language of cultural competence. Um, what I mean, do you have a sense yet of how that should be reframed?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just to say really that cultural competence is um it's kind of this mix of, I would say, three things.
Mhm.
Um Cultural safety, which is, actually I'll start with cultural competence. Cultural competence is how much we know about a culture, and can you introduce yourself in Māori, for example? At least that's sort of the standard in New Zealand, I think. Cultural safety is knowing how and when to use that. Somebody that has Māori lineage but has never learned a single word of Māori culture might be taken aback and might feel ashamed that somebody who they're working with knows more Māori than they do. So the cultural safety is knowing when to use it. And so that's cultural competency, cultural safety. And the final thing is cultural joy, um,
Yeah,
which is how do we celebrate what it means to be queer? How do we celebrate what it means to be Māori? Because these cultures are amazing and we don't get to see that enough because our cultural competence is surrounded by targeting a deficit, if that makes sense.
yeah, no, it does.
Or targeting targeting the deficit.
Yeah. So what? So what are some of the barriers to achieving that, and how might we start to remove some of those barriers?
Yeah, I think it's always tricky. That's like the age-old question, I think, yeah. Um I think one of the things that I have loved doing is learning about culture, but not from the position of a deficit. Um
Yeah,
I think at least the training that happens in New Zealand is often, oh, let's learn about cultural competency, but we learn about it in respect to Pākehā or white people who came to New Zealand, and what the impact was, but we kind of don't often just talk about Māori culture in and of itself.
yeah,
Or we might speak about queer culture and say, this is how. marriage inequality affected queer people, or um, I'm trying to think of something else. This is how heterosis normativity or the normality of being heterosexual affected queer people. Whereas I think the way that we kind of overcome that as clinicians is to just learn about the cool stuff about in queer culture.
Yeah.
I only just recently learned about like Vogue balls and stuff. I don't
Yeah.
know if you, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I only just learned about this, and I've been queer for oh my gosh, 12 years now.
Hmm.
And I want clinicians to see the joy that's in these cultures, rather than what we often get taught, which is how these cultures are being affected by negative things.
Yeah.
And I think that's cultural joy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what it sounds like is that therefore, I mean that peer leadership is going to be extremely important, and empowering peer
Mm.
leaders is a key to achieving that.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's the key to supporting our clients through coming out, through discovering who they are is by being in contact with people who have done the same thing and have found joy in their identities.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Peer support, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Um, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think sometimes we don't capture our own history in terms of how we have campaigned for the changes that we have achieved, and how we kind of try and learn both the positives and the negatives from our own past that can help us face the challenges that we've got now. And I think that when you look back, as you say, the things like the Vogue balls were very challenging for people, but they were also incredibly empowering for people at the same time. And I think it's just sort of learning about where we have really good examples of how we've challenged norms, and,
Mhm.
and done it in a very joyful and powerful way is so important.
Yeah, I think that there's so many examples of just queer joy that I think when we really put our minds to it and we really see, I mean, we just had Chapel Roan play in Auckland and is just brought so much queer joy that I think there are things for us to be proud of that we can model cultural competence on as well.
Yeah. So you're in the Pink Pony Club at the moment. So, I mean, you've said a little bit, I think, already about what you would like to see the people who wants to be allies, who want to be culturally competent doing. But what are there other things that you'd like to see allies doing?
Yeah, I think I cannot remember who said this, but they're often on the internet and they're a non-binary leader. They're also a comedian and I cannot remember their name. So if somebody knows it, hopefully they can let me know. But this person spoke about how um, how to be an ally is to place yourself in the position of the person that you're trying to ally, that you're trying to be an ally for. And I think they spoke about how being queer is so much more than just categorizations of things that are other than heterosexual or other than cisgender, that queer culture is so much about breaking the boundaries of the patriarchy and breaking the boundaries of traditional gender roles that we've had. And so I think that by extension, every one of us has some element of queerness in some way um, that they break gender roles every day. Um, Women that have jobs by definition break gender roles, or women that wear pants by definition break gender roles. And I think that this person online was mentioning just the role of allyship in the queer community, and how to be a true ally, to understand it, is less about how allies can help us as queer people, but more about how allies can become free themselves. And I thought that was really powerful and something really interesting to think about. Um, and one thing I love talking to clinicians about is, how do you know that you're straight? How do you know that you're this, that, and the other? How do you know how to behave in traditional or heterosexual relationships? Like, where does that come from? Because when I got into a queer relationship, that was the thing that came to mind for me, where I had no idea what to expect. And I didn't know who I was, whereas I had always kind of been taught this in the back of my head. And so I love getting clinicians to just question how the structure of what they kind of deem as normal, or allies as part of the queer community who might identify as heterosexual or cisgender, how they have come to terms with their identity, and, and what might have influenced that identity to come about. Um, and by definition, how have you maybe freed yourself from maybe traditional gender roles? How have the people around you done that? Because that is what queer identity is. That's what it means to be queer, is to um, question the gender binary,
Yeah.
question heterosexuality, and allow people to be who they are. So I love asking that question
Yeah.
to allies. Love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think there are things that we can learn from the the combination of queer culture and Maori culture? Do you think there are things we can learn from Maori queer people?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because a lot of people in New Zealand don't actually know this. Um, how accepting Māori people were of queer people, and how truly embedded queer culture was in Māori tanga or Māori culture before we were colonized. There are so many stories about queer people existing in Māori culture before colonization. Māori people created beautiful artwork that has been sold all around the world, and was given away because of colonization and this want to sort of by missionaries to basically eradicate sexism and Māori culture. And so there's this beautiful story of two men in Māori culture, which is where the term takatapu comes from, um, that basically just exemplifies sexual freedom. A lot of people also don't know that in Māori culture we don't really have terms for gender either. And I mean, we do have terms in terms of like a wahine means woman, tane means man, but in terms of actually have gendered pronouns. Um, uh, some of our we believe in like a polytheist sort of religion.
Mhm.
I wouldn't really call it a religion, but just polytheist, but a
Yeah.
spirituality, where multiple people, multiple gods, goddesses are deemed as non-binary. Um, and there's so much that we can learn from early Māori culture in terms of how gender is portrayed, how sexuality is portrayed as not something that's other, but as part of.
Yeah.
Not something to be categorized, but to be embodied. Yeah, absolutely, we can learn.
Yeah. Sounds great. Um, so what are you looking for from leaders? What does being a good leader look like to you?
Um, well, I think leadership looks like both breaking boundaries and also having the compassion to pull the slowest person up behind you. And what I mean by that is to break boundaries in terms of the values that we have, to be open to teaching people about what it means to be culturally competent in queer culture, to push the boundaries of what we as clinicians know about takatapu culture, but also to have the compassion and gentleness to know that with change comes time. It takes time for people to learn about this stuff. It takes energy for people to become motivated to learn about this. So both of those things I think um, is required in leadership. And I think in the leaders that I've seen, um, that's what sticks out the most to me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really important point. What would your advice be to someone starting out now?
Um, and this is so cheesy, but just be yourself.
Yeah.
And I know that everyone says that, but what I mean when I say be yourself is be utterly, authentically nothing else but you. Um, and I think of so many times when this was a barrier for me coming into this sort of work. I remember having a conversation with one of my family members of talking about my lived experience in mental health. And they didn't want me to talk about it at all because they were scared of what it would look like or how people would perceive me. But Peter, people were perceiving me in one type of way or another because I'm Maori and I'm gay. So, um, but that's part of who I am, and that's why I get to do cool stuff like this with you. It's my passion, it's who I am, and nothing else has gotten me further in life than by being authentic, truly, and leading with love, I think, as well.
I mean, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.